Yorana, c'est Nani de Pacific Venturi. Bienvenue dans ce nouvel épisode de Pacific Oe, le podcast d'analyse de l'actualité globale et locale qui t'aide à naviguer efficacement dans ce monde changé. Cette semaine, nous nous sommes intéressés à une initiative récemment rendue publique qui a été initiée et portée par le Club de Rome, un groupe de réflexion réunissant des scientifiques, des économistes, des fonctionnaires nationaux et internationaux, ainsi que des industriels de 52 pays, et qui se préoccupe des problèmes complexes auxquels doivent faire face toutes les sociétés tant industrialisées qu'en développement. Cette nouvelle initiative, intitulée Earth for All, a pour objectif d'encourager et d'accélérer, sur un horizon de 10 ans, les changements systémiques nécessaires pour créer un futur plus équitable sur une planète aux ressources limitées en faisant face aux défis du changement climatique. Pour en parler, nous recevons Christian Schot, professeur associé en management du tourisme et président du comité de pilotage sur les principes d'un management responsable de l'éducation à l'Université de Victoria à Wellington.
Christian Yarana, welcome to Tahiti for this trip of yours.
Thank you, merci.
First of all, can you introduce yourself for our listeners, please?
Sure. So, my name is Christian Schot. I'm an associate professor in sustainable tourism management at Te Heranga Waka, Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand. And it's a great pleasure to be here and for the people of French Polynesia to host me at the University of the French Pacific. And maruru to everyone who allowed me to be here.
Thank you. So we're here to talk about the recent Earth for All initiative that was launched by the Club of Rome recently and that published some of their proposals. What's your overall view on this initiative?
That's a really interesting question because we come from different perspectives. Most members of the Club of Rome are economists or are related to economics. So obviously the lens through which they see the world is an economic lens predominantly. I am a geographer and I look at it through the lens of tourism, and we're all dealing of course with the same issues. And I think overall this is absolutely important, and for an organization such as the Club of Rome to make this comment is crucial. They made a similar comment back in 1972, and although there was a lot of attention, it wasn't taken up as much as everybody was hoping. So it's really important. It's great to have this, and I'm very pleased that they formulated their ideas clearly. I suppose firstly, I'm not able to look deeply into it yet because the publication has just come out. But will it allow everybody to make changes, or is it more directed at governments through economic tools? So from what I could see, its strength are that it gives specific guidance to governments for their fiscal policies, for example, for how to run the country, and hopefully there will also be enough in there for companies. Big companies, small companies. And when you're dealing with tourism, the vast majority of the companies are very small companies. And they are working hard to survive. So I suppose we'll have to see a little bit more of the detail to understand the detail. But overall, it's a really important and a very poignant statement, I think, by the Club of Rome.
Yeah, indeed. And so as you said, your specialty is tourism. So when we look at it through the spectrum of tourism, we can see that one of the proposals of this initiative is to eliminate poverty. And one way to do it is, as they propose, to implement new economic models for low-income countries. Obviously, in the Pacific, most of our islands are low-income countries, and many of them are relying on tourism to sustain themselves. Yet we know that tourism today is somehow questioned by many people, by many organizations, and on many aspects the environmental impact, the uncertain perspective due to the economic context that we all know about. So as we're trying to develop our island economies and find new ways to develop them, can tourism still be a key option in that situation?
I would have to say yes, because I believe in a form of tourism that is a force of good, a force for good, and that can be transformational. We need to work hard at it, but tourism should be contributing to the place where the tourism takes place. So it should be contributing to the community's well-being, the environment's well-being, as well as the economic well-being. But with the economic well-being not being seen through the more traditional economic lens, but more about the distribution of the income or the distribution of any wealth that might come into the community. So tourism can be very powerful if done well, and the world leaders in highly sustainable forms of tourism are indigenous people. And the Pacific Islands are full, sounds a bit odd, but are mostly populated by indigenous people. So indigenous communities often have that natural approach that means they balance the environment versus the people versus the economy, whichever shape that might take. And in New Zealand, we're now looking at a policy that is quite, or a new tourism approach that is focusing increasingly on regeneration and very strongly driven by Maori cultural values, because the communities have been living in harmony for a long time. I think it's more the Western approach that has forgotten how to keep that balance. We once had it too, but we've lost it along the way. So I would not look so much at Pacific Island nations being low-income countries, but rich in indigenous culture and indigenous knowledge. And that, applied to tourism as to other things, can be incredibly powerful and help the communities achieve what they want to achieve in terms of well-being for the community, education, whatever they say they want, rather than what we may think they should have.
You're not an economist, but would that mean also developing economic models based on this indigenous knowledge and culture and understanding of their own context?
Yeah, that's a bit difficult for me to talk about. I know that donut economics have been picked up by some tourism destinations in particular. So Amsterdam is actually trialing the donut economics developed by Rawforth, I think. Yeah. But I suppose in the end, if it works for the communities, I think it's bigger than economics. That's the thing. I think we sometimes get stuck thinking about how money circulates through an economy, but a truly sustainable and even regenerative approach should go well beyond that. There should also be, of course, well-being for the tourist as well as well-being for the community members. So there should be a sense of well-being simply for meeting on equal ground, that they learn about each other, so that it's not just dictated by money. There are different values at play. And in indigenous cultures, from what I have learned, many of those values have nothing to do with money and with economic flows through society. It's often about guardianship over the land and the sea. It's often about a real sense of hospitality, being welcoming, respecting your guests, and your guests respecting you. And also the kinship, that communities are very collectivist. There's a lot of sharing. So again, a lot of things that in Western culture we don't probably practice to the same extent. So I'm trying to move away from the economic question because it's not my domain. I'm not the right person to answer it, but I also think it needs to be much bigger than that. And that's what I wonder we need to think about. So this, if I understand it correctly, this new document is very powerful, but driven by economists. And there's a whole world out there that is bigger than economics. So I think we need the psychologists, we need the sociologists, we need the developers, we need everybody who's involved in society.
And the cultural practitioner also.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we need change on so many levels. But I appreciate that maybe the Club of Rome can really give tools towards achieving what is articulated in the Sustainable Development Goals, because they are goals, but they don't necessarily have the tools behind them. But again, I would think we need to tread very carefully that the communities of the Pacific Islands tell us what they want, and that we don't tell them what we think they should do.
Indeed. So on a more practical aspect of things, the initiative also talks a lot about finding ways to decarbonize our economies, but the atmosphere more concretely, and to reduce our energy consumption. But to bring tourists in Tahiti or in the Pacific in general, that requires long-haul flights or big cruise ships, both being quite problematic in terms of carbon emissions and all that. So what can be done to solve this kind of conundrum, and can we hope to have net zero tourism in 2050 or even earlier, or at some point, anytime?
Yeah, so if I consider New Zealand as part of the Pacific, we are battling with exactly the same issue. We have this dependency on markets that predominantly have to come from elsewhere. So we are sharing this challenge, but I think there are some approaches. And I suppose there are three different angles to this. One is promoting domestic tourism as much as possible. That is, in a Aotearoa New Zealand context, very powerful. I realize that in French Polynesia, there is a much more sparse population around. The next step is, I think we need to be realistic that the long-haul markets are just not our future. So the UK market to New Zealand has been dropping for 10 years. Concerns about the carbon footprint of the flights, as well as the costs of flights. So the carbon taxes that the British government's introduced, as well as the European government. And realistically, our markets need to be closer. Our friends that come to see us need to be half the distance, if not even less than that. So, that should probably also be reflected in the languages that we promote if we want students to learn about the tourism industry. I think there are still some opportunities for that, but it also needs to be combined with longer stays. So, what we used to have is that people might jet from New Zealand over to Sydney for a weekend to go shopping. That just doesn't sit with this new reality that we're increasingly realizing. So it needs to be longer stays, just taking our time, slow tourism in all respects. And one nice trip a year hopefully can somehow be compensated for, because we also appreciate that destinations need some of that tourism income. And the third dimension would be to, of course, also ensure that the destination itself has opportunities to use regenerative electricity, and maybe in the case of Tahiti Nui, it's solar panels or even wind turbines, because I've had quite a bit of wind since I've been here. So, and they're called the Windward Islands, so there must be a bit of wind. So that's probably the least important part, because the bulk of the emission comes from flying. But it's a long way to come from France to Tahiti. It's a long way to come from Germany to New Zealand. The US is half the distance. South America is roughly that distance. Then there's Australia for the Pacific. There's New Zealand. There's Southeast Asia.
And those markets are also growing, so there's potential there.
Very rapidly growing, but of course historical links are strongly to, in the case of New Zealand, to the UK, in the case of the French Pacific, to France. But I feel that the whole Pacific is moving on. They're gaining a greater identity of being the Pacific, the people of the Pacific. And I think that will allow some opportunities for tourism to celebrate the positive force that it can be.
So in the light of those guidelines proposed by the Earth for All initiative, and I'm guessing I know the answer that you'll give anyway, but are you optimistic for the tourism industry to be able to address this challenge of climate change and of just changing and reshaping the way it's done up until now, to kind of like be able to pass on to the new context that is unfolding in front of us?
Yes, I am optimistic, but we do need to be realistic that there will be quite a bit of pain with this. Some of the old, very archaic structures probably won't be able to make that transition. So there will be it needs to be quite a heavy transition. And it also might not be tourism as we have thought about it in the past. We are all tourists, we all travel, but it doesn't mean we necessarily need to stay in 5-star hotels. So we need to have very luxurious experiences. It's really about the original idea of people meeting, people getting to know about other places, and well-being on both sides. The community experiences well-being and the tourists. So there's quite a bit of rethinking that we need to do, and then for the governments to say, let's do this, but after very wide consultation. And then I think, yes, there is a place, but it will look different to our 1980s model of tourism, or even the 1990s.
Yeah, sure. And so in that regards, for whoever is listening to this podcast and would like to be an agent of change and help the industry or societies in general in the region to become more sustainable, to become more resilient, what would you like to recommend? I'm guessing there's a whole list of ideas, but maybe one or two that you think are keys, at least to generate the start that we need.
Yeah, thank you. That is actually, of course, the most difficult question, because it's about that fine balance between making people feel empowered that there are things they can do without putting a burden on them so that they just feel so overwhelmed that they give up. I think it's just about being mindful about the decisions you make. That is the first major step. And thinking about the things you usually do, why do you do them that way? And are there ways of doing it differently? And also questioning. So I'm not going to say you need to be, you need to be running a school strike for climate every Friday. It's more that everybody is taking some responsibility, and that together with the government changing course quite drastically, and with companies feeling the pressure from the government and from the consumers, and hopefully driven by their own values of not just survival but making the planet a good place to live, that should lead to some change. So we need it at all levels, of course. But if people just rethink what they do, why they do it, and make some choices that are better than they used to be, it's a great start.
Well, thank you, and I'm sure that all your analysis and insight would be helpful to start questioning. Christian Marurua, thank you very much for taking the time with us.
Thank you very much, Maruru.
L'initiative Earth for All, comme les éléments partagés par Christian dans cet épisode, peuvent paraître évidents et déjà connus de tous. Mais l'objectif de l'initiative, comme des projets portés par Christian, n'est-il pas avant tout d'apporter de la clarté dans les objectifs et les priorités des décideurs, tant privés que publics, plutôt que de chercher à innover? Car dans la situation actuelle, ce dont nous avons surtout besoin, c'est d'inspiration et de clarté pour engager, enfin, le changement dont nous avons besoin et s'assurer qu'il ne fasse pas au final à un coût trop important pour nos populations et nos économies. N'hésite pas à partager cet épisode avec ton entourage et à le noter ou le commenter sur ta plateforme de podcast préférée. Si tu veux en savoir plus sur l'initiative Earth for All, n'hésite pas à aller voir la newsletter de THOE sur ce thème. Tu peux la retrouver sur notre site internet pacificventuri.com et tu peux également t'y inscrire pour ne jamais manquer un numéro. À la semaine prochaine pour un nouvel épisode, un nouveau thème. Prends soin de toi, Nana!